She was the kind of woman a whole town could look through like glass, standing right there, solid and real, and somehow invisible anyway. They called her big. They called her plain. They called her useful the way a mule is useful, good for hauling, not worth talking to. But the drought came that summer like a death sentence written in cracked earth and dying cattle, and every man in Dry Creek who'd spent years not looking at Tessa Hale suddenly needed what she'd been carrying all along. This is the story of a woman they overlooked, a man who didn't, and the moment an entire town had to reckon with how badly they'd been wrong. If you're reading this story, please hit like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far my story has come. And don't leave. This story isn't over yet. The flour sack weighed 50 pounds, maybe a little more. Tessa Hale knew because she'd been lifting it the same way for 3 years, knees bent, back straight, one arm under the bottom, and the other gripping the side seam before it could split. She hoisted it onto her shoulder and carried it across the loading dock behind Greer's General Store without stopping to breathe, without asking for help, without making a sound about it. Nobody was watching anyway. That was just a fact of life in Dry Creek, the kind of fact you stop flinching at after a while. The town sat low in a valley between two ridges in New Mexico territory, the kind of place that got built because people ran out of reasons to keep moving west. It wasn't ugly, exactly. The mountains behind it had a hard, spare beauty when the light hit them right, but it wasn't gentle either. The wind came in off the flats and it carried grit in it, the kind that worked into the creases around your eyes and made everybody squint. The buildings along the main road were sun-bleached to the same faded gray-brown, like the whole town was slowly returning to the color of the earth. Tessa set the flour sack down inside the storeroom and went back for the next one. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a heavy braid because loose hair and loading work didn't mix, and dark eyes that tended to notice things, and a body that had been the subject of more jokes in Dry Creek than she could count. She was broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, solid in the way a working woman gets when the work is real. Not soft, not delicate, not anything the men in this town thought was worth a second look. She knew what they called her, Big Tessa, sometimes worse. She'd learned to hear it like she heard the wind. Present, persistent, and not something you could do anything about. The loading work was 3 mornings a week. The rest of the time she mended clothes, shirts with blown-out elbows, dungarees gone thin at the knees, the occasional dress that needed taking in or letting out. She was good at it. Faster than most seamstresses and neater. And she could look at a piece of fabric and tell you before she touched it whether it was worth saving or past help. She charged fair prices and delivered on time, and her customers paid without complaint. And somehow none of that made her anything other than background noise in the life of Dry Creek. She stacked the last sack and stretched her back and walked around to the front of the store. The street was busy for a Tuesday morning. 2 wagons had pulled up near the trough, and a handful of men stood outside the saloon even though it wasn't yet 9 o'clock, which told her something was wrong before she heard any of the talk. Men who had work to do didn't stand around in the early morning unless the news was bad enough to stop them. She slowed her pace. Not enough to look like she was listening. She'd learned that too. Just enough to catch fragments. Third well dry in a week. Harmon's Creek dropped by half. Stock's gonna start dying before the month's out if this keeps... Tessa looked up at the sky. It was the same white-blue it had been for weeks. The color of sky that meant nothing was coming. No clouds building over the ridges, no smell of rain in the air, just that flat, pale heat pressing down from above and the cracked earth pressing up from below, and everything in between drying out a little more with every day that passed. She'd noticed it a month ago. The grass along the south end of her walking route had gone yellow before its time. The creek that ran behind the laundry had dropped its banks by 2 feet. Little things, the kind of things you saw only if you were paying attention to something other than your own concerns. She went into the store to collect her wages. Greer was at the counter. He was a short man with a permanent expression of mild dissatisfaction, like someone had promised him something once and never delivered. He counted out her coins without looking at her directly, slid them across the counter, and went back to his ledger. "Rain coming anytime soon?" he asked, to the ledger rather than to her. "I don't think so," Tessa said. Greer made a sound that wasn't quite words and wasn't quite anything else. "The creek behind the laundry is down," she added. "Lower than I've ever seen it. And the spring at the south end of Harmon's property, I walked past it last week. It's nearly gone. If those are drying up already, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Greer looked at her now, briefly, with the expression of a man deciding whether information from a certain source was worth filing away. He decided it wasn't. "You're not a hydrologist, Tessa." "No," she said. "I'm just somebody who walks everywhere and looks at things." She pocketed her coins and left. Dub. The boarding house where Tessa rented a room was on the north end of town, 2 blocks past the church and 1 past the farrier. It was run by a widow named Mrs. Aldrich, who was not unkind but was very busy, and had long since stopped treating Tessa's presence as anything remarkable. There were 4 other boarders, 2 miners who worked the ridge operation, a school teacher named Mr. Fenn, who read every night until the lamp oil ran out, and a young couple newly arrived who were saving for a property claim. Tessa ate breakfast alone at the kitchen table after the others had left, which was how she preferred it. The conversation at the communal table tended to move around her the way water moves around a stone. Not hostile exactly, just finding its way to other places. She'd stopped trying to redirect it years ago. She had biscuits and black coffee and a piece of hard cheese, and she sat at the table with a notebook open in front of her. She'd had the habit since she was a teenager, writing down things she noticed, things she was thinking about, ideas she didn't have anyone to tell. The notebook had become a record of her own mind over the years, dense with observations about weather and soil and the behavior of water and the small economics of a frontier town that nobody ever asked her about. She wrote, "South Creek at lowest point observed. Greer's Spring likely to fail within 6 to 8 weeks at current rate. Canyon Spring, unknown status, worth investigating. If the water table is dropping across the whole valley, ranchers need to know before they lose stock. Nobody will listen until they're already losing stock." She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the white blue sky just sat there, offering nothing. She heard about Colton Briggs the way she heard about most things, by being present when other people forgot she was there. He'd owned the Briggs Ranch for 4 years out on the valley's East Ridge. It was a decent-sized operation, maybe 300 head of cattle and a working crew of 6, and Colton had built it from a ruined property that his predecessor had run into the ground. People in town had varied opinions about him. The general consensus among the men seemed to be that he was capable but difficult, kept to himself, didn't socialize much, had a directness to him that some people read as rudeness. Among the women, there was a different conversation, the kind Tessa didn't participate in. She'd seen him maybe 4 or 5 times. He came into town infrequently, and when he did, he moved through it efficiently, no lingering. He was tall with dark hair and the kind of face that got weathered young from outdoor work. Not handsome in a comfortable way, more like a landscape that had interesting features if you bothered to look at it properly. He had a scar along his jawline that people had various stories about. He didn't explain it. What she'd noticed, in her particular way of noticing things, was that he watched. Not in the way some men watched, sizing things up for advantage, differently. More like he was trying to understand something. She'd seen him stop in the middle of a transaction at Greer's counter and spend a long moment looking at the wall display of farming tools, not like a man pricing a purchase, but like a man thinking hard about something and just happening to aim his eyes in that direction. She hadn't attached much significance to it. He was a rancher with problems she didn't know about, thinking thoughts she wasn't part of. The first real sign that something was breaking came on a Thursday afternoon, when she was at Mrs. Pruitt's house doing a fitting for a wool coat repair. Mrs. Pruitt was a talker, not a mean woman, but one of those people who processed information through conversation, who needed to narrate events to make them feel real. She talked while Tessa pinned the coat's torn lining. "They're saying Harmon's lost 8 head already," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Just dropped. And the Miller property, their whole east pasture is eaten down to dirt. Cattle ate everything there was before anyone realized how bad the grass had gotten." "How long since the creek dropped on the Miller property?" Tessa asked, not looking up from her work. "Oh, weeks ago, I suppose. Since before the Harmon trouble. You know Jim Miller. He doesn't worry about things until they're right on top of him." She paused. "Hold still, please." Tessa repinned the shoulder seam. If Harmon's water source is failing and Miller's is already gone, then it's moving north to south across the valley. That means everyone on the south end is next, and they probably don't know it yet. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her with the particular expression that people gave Tessa when she said something specific, a sort of startled reassessment, quickly smoothed over. "Well, you seem very sure of yourself." "I'm not sure of anything," Tessa said. "I'm just looking at where things are going." She finished the fitting, collected her pay, and walked home with the sun at a low angle behind her and the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass on both sides of the road. She hadn't meant to end up in the conversation with Colton Briggs. It happened by accident, the way things sometimes do when a town is small enough that you can't avoid each other at the water trough. She was filling her bucket at the public pump when he came up with his horse, a big gray animal with a patient expression. He looked at the pump and then at her and waited. "Almost done," she said. "No rush." He stood there with the lead rope loose in his hand, and there was a silence that wasn't quite uncomfortable. The silence of two people who don't talk much, standing next to each other. Then he said, "You work at Greer's." It wasn't quite a question. 3 mornings a week, she said. "You said something to him last week, about the water." She looked at him. "You heard that?" "I was in the back picking up my order. Greer didn't think much of it." "Greer doesn't think much of anything I say," she said, and finished filling her bucket and stepped back from the pump. "Help yourself." She picked up the bucket and started to walk. "What did you mean," he said, "about the spring at the south end of Harmon's property?" She stopped, turned halfway. He was looking at her steadily, not in the way she was used to people looking at her, not with the dismissal already in place before the words started, more like someone who actually wanted an answer. "I meant it's nearly dry," she said. "And if that spring's gone, it means the whole water table in this valley is dropping, not just the surface water. Surface drought you can wait out. Water table dropping is something different." "How do you know it's the water table?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm guessing, based on what I've observed, but I think it's right." He was quiet for a moment. His horse drank from the trough. "What else have you observed?" he asked. Nobody asked Tessa that question. Ever. It landed on her like something thrown from an unexpected direction, and she had to take a moment to find her footing. "A lot," she said, carefully. "I've got time," he said. Cheat. They stood there at the trough for 20 minutes while she told him what she'd been writing in her notebook. The timeline of water drop across different parts of the valley. The sequence of what had failed first and what was failing now. Her estimate of where it was headed. She didn't soften it or hedge it the way she might have with Greer, because something in the way Colton listened made her think softening it would be a waste of both their time. When she finished, he said, "You've been watching this for how long?" "About 6 weeks. "And you've told people?" "I've mentioned it. Nobody's been very interested." Something moved in his expression. It wasn't quite anger, but it had that same heat in it. "Why not?" She looked at him levelly. "Because of who's doing the mentioning." He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, out over the flat line of the valley where the grass was yellow and the sky was white, and the whole landscape had a thin, exhausted look to it. "My east pasture water's down by 1/3, he said. "The well at the main property is still good, but I don't know for how long. I've got 260 cattle and 6 men, and I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks what I'm going to do if the well fails." "There might be water further in," Tessa said. "Beyond the canyon on the east side. I've heard there's a spring somewhere in that terrain. Old survey maps mentioned it, but nobody's been in there in years because of the terrain and the people who use it as a hideout." He turned back to look at her. "That's Garner territory." "I know. That's not just difficult terrain. Those men are dangerous." "I know that too," she said. "I'm just telling you what I've heard. What you do with it is your business." She picked up her bucket. Her arm was getting tired. "What's your name, Toyle?" he said. "Tessa Hale." He nodded as if filing it away. "Colton Briggs." "I know," she said. She walked home. The bucket pulled at her shoulder the whole way, and she didn't mind it, because her mind was somewhere else entirely, running back over the conversation like a woman checking a piece of work to make sure the seams were sound. Sam. It was unusual, she told herself, just an unusual conversation. Don't read anything into it. She tried to believe that for about 4 days, and then the boy came. He was one of Colton's ranch hands, a kid named Pedro, who was maybe 15 with a serious face and dusty boots, and he knocked on the boarding house door on a Monday morning and asked for Miss Hale. Mrs. Aldrich gave Tessa a look when she relayed the message. The look meant something, but Tessa couldn't tell what exactly, and she didn't ask. She went to the door. Pedro handed her a folded note. Miss Hale, I'd like to discuss the water situation further. If you're willing, come out to the property tomorrow morning. I'll have someone bring you. The signature was just C, Briggs with no flourish. She read it twice. Mrs. Aldrich was still in the hallway when Tessa turned around, and the look was still on her face. Ranch business? The older woman asked, with the particular careful neutrality of a person holding back a more loaded question. Something like that, Tessa said. The Briggs property was larger than it looked from the valley road. She'd been able to see the main house from a distance, but up close, the ranch spread out across the ridge in a way that gave her a different sense of its scale. The outbuildings, the corrals, the long barn with its sagging middle section, the pasture that stretched east toward the canyon wall. The grass in the pasture was thin, eaten down closer to the dirt than it should be for this time of year. She could see the cattle in the far field, heads down, moving slow. Colton met her at the fence line. He was in work clothes, so not the clean shirt he'd worn in town, and there was dust on him, and he looked like a man who'd been at something since well before dawn. Thanks for coming, he said. He didn't offer to shake her hand, which was fine. He just started walking toward the house, and she fell into step beside him, which she understood to mean he was going to get straight to it. They sat at a table in the kitchen, not the fancy front room, the actual working kitchen, and he spread out a map. It was a rough property survey, hand-annotated with notes in his handwriting, and she leaned over it and looked at it with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for this kind of conversation for a long time. Show me where you think the canyon spring is, he said. She studied the map. Here. She pointed to a spot past the canyon's narrowest point, in terrain marked with the notation uncertain in faded pencil. Or somewhere close to there. The survey's old and probably not precise. The Garner outfit has a camp here. He pointed to a spot about 2 miles from the spring location. Maybe 8 men. They're not just rough. They've killed people who pushed into that territory. I know. She straightened up. That's the obstacle, not the terrain. He looked at her. You're not scared of this. I didn't say that. You're not acting scared. I'm acting like someone who's thought about it, she said. Being scared and thinking clearly aren't mutually exclusive. A long pause. Somewhere outside, one of the hands was working metal. The sound of hammer on iron rang out at intervals, steady and flat. I want to find that spring, he said. If it exists and if it's accessible, it could save this ranch and feed water to half the valley. But I need someone with me who understands the terrain logic, who can read the land and figure out where water's going to be before we walk into somewhere we can't come back from. Tessa sat with that for a moment. You're asking me to come on the expedition? Yes. Not to consult from here. To come. Yes. She thought about the notebook on her table, the 6 weeks of observations, the careful, considered conclusions that Greer had dismissed in 10 seconds, and every other man in Dry Creek hadn't bothered to hear at all. She thought about 50-pound flour sacks and Mrs. Pruitt's expression and the long habit of being furniture in other people's rooms. She said, All right. He nodded. Not with relief, not with gratitude, just with the steady, functional acknowledgement of a man checking something off a list of things that needed doing, which she found, oddly, more respectful than either of the alternatives. There's something you should know, he said. People in town are already talking about the fact that I had you out here. What are they saying? Things I'm not going to repeat. He met her eyes. I want to be clear that I don't give a damn what they say, but I want you to know it's happening so you're not blindsided. She absorbed that, the particular texture of what he was telling her, that people were already applying their particular interpretation to a practical conversation between two people thinking about water, was familiar. The specific shape of smallness in other people's imaginations, the way any man who paid her any kind of attention got immediately assigned a motive that had nothing to do with competence. I've been living in this town for 6 years, she said. I know how people talk. I imagine you do, he said. Another pause, but this one was different. It had a kind of honesty in it, the kind that comes when two people have acknowledged something real and difficult and moved past it. "When do you want to go?" she said. "End of the week. I want 2 days to prepare, and I want to send someone ahead to get a better read on where the Garner camp is positioned. I'll need to tell Mrs. Aldrich I'll be gone." "I'll pay your rate," he said. "Same as whatever you make in a week." "I don't know what my rate is for this kind of work," she said. "I've never done it before." "Neither have I," he said. "We'll figure it out." She walked back to town the long way through the dry grass at the edge of the valley road, because she needed the time to think. The sky above her was still that flat, implacable white blue, and the grass beside the road whispered in the wind, and her mind was running fast and a little sideways in the way it did when something significant had shifted. She thought about what it was going to cost her, in town talk, in reputation, in the elaborate, careful structure of tolerated invisibility she'd built in Dry Creek over 6 years. She'd learned that being invisible had a certain protection in it. People didn't notice you, but they also didn't aim at you. Going on an expedition with Colton Briggs, sleeping at a ranch camp, being publicly associated with a man who people admired and speculated about, that was going to break the invisibility, and she didn't know yet what came after that. She thought about the cattle she'd seen in his east pasture, moving slow. She thought about what a full drought looked like, the sequence of it, the livestock dying, then the smaller operations folding, then the families who depended on those operations making the terrible calculation about whether to stay or go. She thought about Dry Creek 6 months from now if the water didn't hold. She thought about the spring, wherever it was, cold in the dark rock beyond the canyon wall. She kept walking. The boarding house was visible now, and the smoke from someone's kitchen fire was moving sideways in the wind, and Dry Creek sat in its valley like it had always sat there, in the sun and the dust and the hard, specific indifference of a place that didn't care what any one person thought or felt about it. Nobody asked you to save anything, she told herself. This is one ranch and one man's practical problem, and you said yes because he asked you and he listened to you, and that combination is unusual enough to be dangerous. She knew she was right about that. She went inside anyway. The next morning, she went to the general store, not to work, but to pick up a few things she needed, and 3 women she knew by name were standing near the bolts of fabric, and they went quiet when she came in. She knew what that quiet was. She'd been in the radius of that quiet before, though never quite aimed at her directly. Usually she was far enough outside the social life of Dry Creek that she didn't generate enough interest to be talked about. That had apparently changed. She bought her things and was at the door when one of the women, Clara Hayes, whose husband ran the feed supply, said, almost casually, "You've been spending time out at the Briggs Ranch." Tessa turned. "I've been out once, for a work discussion." "Work," Clara said, with the particular tone of a woman placing quotation marks around a word without using them. Tessa looked at her. Not with anger. She was too tired for anger and too old in this town for surprise. But directly. Long enough that Clara's certainty shifted just slightly in her expression. "I'm helping figure out where the water is," Tessa said, "because everyone's water is running out and someone needs to do it. But thank you for the concern." She paused. "About my work." She pushed out through the door before anyone could answer. She got half a block down the road before she let herself feel it. The familiar clench in her chest, the old weight of it. Not shame, exactly. More like exhaustion. The exhaustion of being a woman in a small town who had one kind of value assigned to her and would spend her whole life fighting to be seen as anything else. She breathed through it. It passed, mostly. She went home and finished her mending orders and ate supper at the table alone while Mr. Ben read in the next room, and the wind pushed at the window glass with its dry, patient pressure, asking to be let in. At the bottom of a new notebook page, she wrote, "End of the week, Canyon Country. Don't overthink it." Then she closed the notebook and got ready for bed. Outside, the white blue sky had gone to black, and somewhere to the east, past the ridge, past the flat broken land between here and the canyon wall, there was water hidden in the dark, cold and still and waiting for someone who was paying attention to come find it. Tessa Hale pulled the quilt up around her shoulders and lay there in the dark and tried to sleep. She was mostly successful. The morning Tessa was supposed to leave for the Briggs Ranch, She woke up before the sun and lay still for a while, listening to the boarding house breathe around her. The creak of the floorboards in the wall, the distant cough of one of the miners, the wind working at the eave above her window. She'd slept poorly, which she'd expected. She'd packed her bag the night before, which had helped, because packing gave her something to do with her hands while her mind ran its circles. She had a canvas satchel, medium-sized, with a change of clothes and her notebook and a small tin of the salve she used for her hands when the mending work made them crack. She added a folding knife at the last moment, not because she thought she'd need it, but because it seemed like the kind of trip where having it was better than not. Pedro came for her at first light with a spare horse, a brown mare with a white blaze and an expression of mild boredom that Tessa found immediately reassuring. She tied her satchel to the saddle and swung up. Not gracefully, she never mounted gracefully. She was too broad across the hip and too heavy in the middle for grace. And settled herself, and Pedro didn't comment on any of it, just turned his horse toward the ridge road and started moving. She was grateful for the quiet. It was the kind of morning that almost justified the drought. The light coming in long and flat across the dry grass, turning everything gold yellow and still. The kind of light that made the ugly things in a landscape look considered. Tessa watched the ridge grow closer and thought about water and tried not to think about Clara Hayes's face in Greer's store. She failed at the second part, but the first part mostly worked. Colton was at the fence when they arrived, talking to a lean, sunburned man Tessa hadn't met before. They broke off their conversation when she rode up, and Colton came over and held her horse's bridle while she dismounted, which she neither asked for nor resented. "This is Roy Casper," he said, nodding toward the lean man. "He rode out yesterday toward the canyon to get a look at the Garner camp positions." Roy Casper looked at Tessa with a careful, measuring expression that she knew was trying to figure out what she was doing there and what category to put her in. She returned the look steadily and let him sort it out. "Miss Hale," he said, eventually. "Mr. Casper," she said. They went into the kitchen. Roy spread out a hand-drawn sketch on the table. Rougher than Colton's survey map, but more recent, with positions marked in pencil. "Main camp's about here." He pointed to a spot in the canyon's wide section, northeast of where Tessa had estimated the spring to be. 4 men when I looked, 2 more moving around on the south edge. I think they rotate through, so the number varies. The whole outfit's maybe 7, 8 people total. They're not organized like soldiers, but they're armed, and they've been out here long enough to know the terrain better than we do. "What are they doing out there?" Tessa asked. Roy looked at her. "Ma'am? What's their operation? Are they just using the canyon as a hideout, or are they working something out there?" Roy glanced at Colton, then back at her. "Running cattle, probably stolen. Using the canyon as a holding area. Terrain keeps people out." "So they need the water too," she said. Both men looked at her. "If there's a spring in that canyon and they've been there long enough to know the terrain," she said, "then they know about it. And if they know about it, they might have a camp closer to it than your sketch shows." Silence. Roy's pencil hovered over his sketch. Colton's jaw tightened slightly. "That's possible," Roy said slowly. "I didn't go in far enough to see the whole—" "We need to know before we go in," Tessa said. She wasn't trying to be harsh about it. She was just saying the thing that needed to be said. "Otherwise, we're walking into something we're not reading right." Colton leaned on the table. He was quiet for a moment in the way she was starting to recognize. Not hesitation, more like internal calculation. "Roy, can you go back today? Get eyes on the far section of the canyon before the end of the day?" "I can try." Roy didn't look thrilled, but he wasn't the kind of man who said no to reasonable requests. He folded up his sketch and went out. Left alone in the kitchen, Colton and Tessa sat at the table with the original survey map between them. The light through the window was climbing, and outside the sound of the ranch starting its day drifted in. Boot steps on hard ground, the low complaint of cattle, a horse blowing through its nose. "You were right to ask that," Colton said. "I know," she said, not arrogantly, just stating it. His mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "You're not much for false modesty." "False modesty wastes time," she said, "and you didn't hire me for modesty." "I didn't hire you for anything yet," he said. "You haven't told me what you want." She looked at the map. What I want is to find the spring. What I want after that we can negotiate. He nodded. That was apparently sufficient. She spent most of that day at the ranch, which was not what she'd expected. She'd thought there would be immediate activity, a plan, a departure, the forward momentum of a thing in motion. Instead, the day moved slowly, the way working days do when the work is preparation rather than action. She walked the property with Colton in the late morning, which was partly about showing her the current state of the water sources, and partly, she suspected, about Colton needing to move while he thought. He was a pacer, she decided, a man who needed physical motion to get his mind to run clearly. She didn't mind it. She walked fast, and his stride was long, and they matched pace without discussing it. He showed her the east pasture well first. The water level was low. She could see it when she leaned over the edge, that dark surface too far below the rim, reflecting the sky back in a narrow circle. She took her notebook out and wrote down the measurement he gave her and the date, which made him look at her with the same expression he'd had at the water trough in town. That unguarded interest, like a man seeing something he hadn't expected. "You keep records like that?" he said. "I keep records of everything," she said. "It's how I think." "I should do that." "You should," she agreed, without softening it. They walked to the north end of the pasture where the grass had gone thinnest, and he told her about the summer 3 years ago when the water had been so good you couldn't have known something like this was coming, and she listened and didn't say anything obvious about how drought was unpredictable and nobody could have prepared for it perfectly, because he knew that, and he wasn't asking for absolution. He was just talking the way people do when they've been carrying something alone for a long time, and someone appears who can hold the other end. "The men on the crew," she said, after a while. "They know I'm here?" "Yes." "What do they think?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mixed," he said. "Roy's practical. If you're useful, you're useful. Cal Reeder's been here since I bought the property. He tends to trust my judgment, even when he doesn't understand it. The others are newer, and they'll take their lead from those two." "And if they don't come around?" "Then they don't come around," he said. "But they'll do their jobs." She appreciated that he didn't promise her everyone would be warm or welcoming. It was more useful to know the real shape of things than to be surprised by it later. That afternoon, she sat in the barn out of the sun and went through the survey map with the detail it deserved. Not just the spring location, but the topography around it, the drainage lines, the way water would move through that canyon system if there was any significant rainfall. She was working out, in her own head, the logic of why the spring would be where it was, which would help her locate it precisely when they got there. Water didn't do random things. It followed the logic of the land, and if you understood the land, you could follow it. One of the ranch hands came into the barn while she was working. He was young, maybe 20, with a reddish sunburn and the slightly wary look of someone not sure of the social situation he'd walked into. He stopped when he saw her. "Sorry, I was just getting the—" He gestured vaguely at a wall of tools. "Go ahead," she said, without looking up from the map. He got what he'd come for, a coil of rope, and lingered for a moment. She could feel him trying to figure out what she was. "Are you really going into the canyon with us?" he asked. She looked up. "Yes." "Is that—" He stopped. "Is it what?" she said, without sharpness. He shifted the rope on his shoulder. "I mean, it's rough in there. I don't know if I can handle it," she said. He had the decency to look uncomfortable rather than double down. "I don't mean any offense." "I didn't take any," she said, which was partially true. "What's your name?" "Danny Marsh." "Danny, I'll tell you what I told your boss. Being uncertain about something doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to account for what you don't know and move accordingly." Danny Marsh considered this with the expression of a young man receiving advice he wasn't sure applied to him and wasn't sure it didn't. He nodded once, more to end the conversation than in real agreement, and went back out into the afternoon. Tessa went back to the map. Roy came back at dusk with better news than she'd feared and worse than they'd hoped. He'd gotten further into the canyon's far section and found what he'd suspected. A smaller camp, 2 men, positioned about a half-mile from where the spring ought to be. They weren't at the spring itself, but they were close enough to see anyone approaching it from the west. The approach from the east, through the broken rock terrain was unwatched, but barely passable. They sat in the kitchen again, all 5 of them now. Colton, Roy, Tessa, Cal Reeder, who was a thick-necked, quiet man with capable hands, and Danny Marsh, who sat at the far end of the table and tried not to look like he was paying close attention to everything. "East approach," Tessa said, looking at the sketch. "It's bad going," Roy said. "Loose rock, a narrow passage about here," he pointed, "where you'd have to go single file. Takes twice as long. But they're not watching it. Not that I could see." "Then that's the way." She looked at Colton. "We go in from the east, quiet, before the Garner men are moving. Early morning." Cal Reeder made a sound. "That rock section'll be dark as a pit before dawn." "Then we move slowly," Tessa said. "And if we're wrong about the spring location?" Roy said. He said it like a genuine question, not a challenge. "Then we reassess when we're in there and we have better information." She didn't pretend she had a perfect answer to that. "I don't think I'm wrong, but the map's old and I could be off." Colton had been listening without speaking. He did that, she'd noticed. Let other people work through a problem while he took it all in, then spoke when he had something worth adding. "How confident are you in the East approach logic?" he asked her. 70%, she said. "I'd be lying if I said higher." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's good enough." Roy didn't look fully convinced. Cal Reeder's expression was professionally neutral. Danny Marsh was staring at his hands, but nobody objected. Not because they didn't have doubts. She could see the doubts in the room as clearly as she could see the faces, but because the alternatives were worse, and everyone in that kitchen knew it. The water logic wasn't getting better. The cattle couldn't wait indefinitely. And sending men into the Garner outfit's territory without the best possible read on the terrain was more dangerous than going in with a 70% estimate by a woman nobody in town thought was worth listening to. "Day after tomorrow," Colton said. "That gives Roy time to rest and gives us tomorrow to get the gear ready." He looked at Tessa. "You'll stay here tonight. We've got a spare room." It was phrased as a fact rather than a question, which she could have objected to, but she didn't, because it was practical and she knew it. Riding back to Dry Creek and riding out again in the morning added 2 hours of trail time, and she needed to be rested for what was coming. "All right," she said. The men dispersed. Colton showed her the spare room, which was small and clean and had a single window that looked east toward the canyon country, invisible now in the dark. She could make out the ridgeline against the stars, just barely, a black edge against the black sky. She sat on the bed for a while with her notebook open and wrote down everything from the day that was worth recording: Roy's sketch, the East approach, the positions of the Garner men, her own confidence level in the spring location, things to watch for on the approach. She wrote, "Cal Reeder reads things before he says anything. Danny Marsh, young and uncertain, but he's paying attention. Roy Casper, practical, will trust results over theories." She wrote, "CB listens when other people are talking, doesn't perform confidence he doesn't have, doesn't pretend a 70% is 100. That matters out there." She closed the notebook and lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. The cattle shifting in the far pasture, a horse moving in its stall, the creak of the old building adjusting in the night air. Tomorrow they would prepare. The day after, they would go. She was afraid. Not the paralyzing kind, the functional kind, the kind that sharpens attention and makes you check things twice. She knew the difference because she'd felt both in her life, and this was the second kind. She told herself that was enough. Then she closed her eyes and listened to the canyon country breathing in the dark to the east, and eventually, despite everything, she slept. They left before the sky turned from black to gray. Tessa had been awake for an hour by then, sitting on the edge of the spare room bed with her boots already on, going through the map one more time in the thin light of a candle stub. Not because she'd forgotten anything. She hadn't. She had a good memory, and she'd gone over the route until she could trace it with her eyes closed. But because the act of looking at it settled something in her chest that needed settling. 5 of them rode out: Colton, Roy, Cal, Danny, and Tessa. They took the valley road east until it petered out into trail, then left the trail entirely and picked their way along the base of the ridge, where the ground was harder and the hoofbeats quieter. Nobody talked much. The horses breathed and the tack creaked and the sky above them shifted from black to the deep blue that comes just before first light, and they moved through it like they were trying not to disturb anything. Roy led them to the start of the east approach, just as the horizon began to show its first thin line of color. He'd been right about the terrain. It was bad going, broken rock and loose shale that shifted under the horses' feet and made the animals nervous. They dismounted and led them through the narrow passage, single file, Tessa second in line behind Roy because she knew the geography better than the others, and Roy knew the actual path. The rock walls rose on either side of them, and the passage went tight enough that her shoulders nearly brushed both sides. She could hear Danny Marsh breathing behind her, slightly fast, the breathing of someone working at staying calm. She understood the impulse entirely. Cal Reeder was behind Danny, and Colton was at the rear, leading two horses. Nobody spoke. The passage seemed to have its own rule about sound, that you kept it to yourself or the canyon walls would do something unfriendly with it. It took 40 minutes to clear the passage. On the other side, the terrain opened into a wide, broken bowl of rock and scrub, and the light was better now, the sky above them pale and clear, and there was something in the air that Tessa noticed before she could name it. She stopped walking. Roy, ahead of her, took 2 more steps before he registered her stopping and turned. She was breathing in slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're trying to catch something elusive. The others came to a stop around her without being asked. They were watching her face. "Water," she said quietly. Roy looked around. "I don't see—" "Not see," she said. "Smell. It's faint, but it's there." She turned slightly, tracking it. Coming from the northeast, maybe quarter mile. Colton had come up beside her. She could feel him next to her without looking, the particular stillness of a man who has learned when to be still. "You sure?" Roy said. "No," she said. "Let's go find out." She was off by about 200 yards. The spring came out of the rock at the base of a northeast-facing cliff face, cold and quiet, seeping into a natural basin that had been catching it for longer than anyone alive could say. The basin was maybe 6 feet across, carved smooth by years of water movement, and it was full, clear, dark reflecting, full in the way that something is full when it's fed from deep underground and surface conditions don't touch it. Danny Marsh said something under his breath that wasn't a word. Cal Reeder crouched beside the basin and put his hand in it and held it there for a long moment without speaking. When he took his hand out, his expression had changed in a way that was hard to describe. Some of the professional blankness had gone out of it. "It's cold," he said. "That's good. Means it's deep fed." Roy was already examining the rock around the outflow, tracing where the water came from. "This is a real source. This isn't seasonal." He looked at Tessa. "How did you—" "The drainage lines on the survey," she said. "All of them from the north end converge here if you follow them back far enough. The water table has to come out somewhere, and this is the logical place." She paused. "And the smell." Colton was standing at the edge of the basin, looking at the water, and his face was doing the same thing Cal's had done. Some private accounting happening behind his eyes that she didn't have access to but could feel the weight of. "We can pipe from here," he said. It wasn't a question. "If you can negotiate access or secure the territory," Roy said, and left the rest of that sentence alone, because the rest of that sentence was about the Garner outfit, and everyone knew it. "One thing at a time," Colton said. "First we know it's real." They spent 20 minutes at the spring, measuring outflow, examining the rock, figuring the rough distance back to the ranch's east pasture line. The numbers were good, not perfect. The terrain would make piping difficult and expensive, but good enough that the ranch could survive if they could work out the access question. Tessa wrote everything down in her notebook while the others talked, filling in the numbers as they came. She was the first one to hear it. A sound from somewhere south carried on the still morning air, the sound of hooves on rock. She put her hand up, flat, and the conversation stopped. Everybody listened. The hoofbeats were moving, plural, at least 2 horses, maybe 3, coming from the direction of the wider canyon section where Roy had placed the secondary Garner camp. "We need to go," Tessa said, low and even. "Now, back through the passage." Nobody argued. Roy was already moving, and Cal had the horses turned before she finished the sentence. They moved fast and quiet, the spring disappearing behind them, and the sound of the approaching horses was getting clearer in the still air. They made it to the passage entrance and filed in, and Danny went first this time with one of the horses, then Roy, then Cal, then Tessa, then Colton at the rear. Halfway through the passage, the rain started. It didn't build up gradually the way most storms did. It came in from the north in a wall, one of those late summer storms that had been gathering heat and pressure for days, and finally found its angle. And when it hit the canyon, it hit hard. Rain and wind together, the kind that stings your face and takes your vision down to 10 feet in front of you. The horses panicked immediately. Danny's mare reared back in the narrow passage, and her hindquarters hit the rock wall, and she screamed, that particular horse sound that cuts through any other noise, and Danny lost the lead rope. "Danny," Tessa's voice, sharp and carrying, "get the wall, Chit. Press into it and let her come past you." She couldn't see if he did it. The rain was sheeting, and the noise of it off the rock walls made everything into chaos. She pressed her own horse tight against her, both hands on the bridle, talking low and steady into its ear, even though she could barely hear herself. Behind her she heard Colton's voice, not words exactly, but the tone of a man managing something dangerous. Ahead, she could hear Roy trying to get the passage moving again. The passage exit was maybe 30 feet away, but it might as well have been 300. The storm had turned the loose rock underfoot into something unreliable, and the wind was coming through the passage in gusts that made it hard to stand square. Her horse was shaking. She could feel it through both hands on the bridle. And she kept talking to it, kept the pressure even and the tone level. And it didn't bolt because she didn't let it bolt. She found Danny by nearly running into him. He was pressed against the rock wall like she'd told him, his horse gone ahead without him, his face white even in the gray storm light. "You all right?" she said, close to his ear. "The horse is in front of Roy, probably. Can you move?" He nodded, not convincingly. "Move," she said, and put a hand on his arm and got him going. The passage exit opened into the wider broken bowl, and the rain hit them full when they came through. No more canyon walls to break it. Tessa squinted through the water running down her face and could make out Roy ahead, 2 horses with him and Cal just behind. Danny stumbled on the shale and she caught his arm. "Where's Colton?" Cal called over the rain. Tessa turned. The passage entrance was dark and empty. Her stomach dropped. She handed Danny off to Cal without saying anything and went back toward the passage. "Tessa," Roy's voice, warning in it. She went back in anyway. The passage was worse than before. The water was running off the rock walls now, channeling down the floor in thin, cold streams, and the footing was worse, and the visibility was nearly nothing. She moved along the left wall with one hand on the rock face and called his name. She found him about 15 feet in. His horse had come down. Not fallen, but slipped badly on the wet rock and gone to its knees, and Colton had been trying to get it up, and the angle was wrong. The horse was scared and fighting him, which was making it worse. "Get out of the way," Tessa said. "It needs to—" "I know what it needs. Move." He looked at her in the gray dark, water running down his face, and moved. She crouched in front of the horse and put both hands on its face and talked to it the same way she'd talked to her own horse. Low, close, ignoring the noise and the rain and the rock floor and the fact that her knees were soaked and her hands were cold. Just the horse and her voice and the steady pressure of her hands. She felt the animal's breathing change under her palms, from fast and ragged to something slower. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, let's go." She stood and put one hand on the bridle, and the horse came up on the second try, scrambling on the wet rock but making it, and she walked it toward the exit with Colton right beside her, and they came out into the open in the rain and the wind and the pale, violent light of a storm in full anger. The 4 men were where she'd left them, huddled in the partial shelter of a boulder outcrop, 2 horses with them. Colton's horse went to them immediately, spooked but moving. Tessa let go of the bridle and stood in the rain for a moment, hands at her sides, breathing. She was shaking. She noticed it distantly, the way you notice something about yourself when the immediate problem is handled and the body gets around to reporting on its own condition. Her hands were trembling with the cold or the adrenaline or both, and her left shoulder hurt from where she'd hit the rock wall without fully registering it, and the rain was getting in her eyes, and she was standing in the middle of a broken rock field in a canyon with a dangerous outlaw camp half a mile south. She thought, absurdly, I should have brought a hat. Roy said something she couldn't hear over the rain. She moved toward the others. They sheltered behind the boulders until the worst of the storm passed, which took the better part of an hour. Nobody talked much. Danny had his arms wrapped around himself and was staring at the ground in the way of someone replaying a bad few minutes on a loop. Cal Reeder was doing something methodical with a piece of rope, not because it needed doing, but because he was the kind of man who needed his hands occupied when things were uncertain. Roy watched the direction of the Garner camp with a flat professional attention, checking every few minutes. Colton sat beside Tessa without appearing to have specifically chosen to do so. It just happened that way. After a while, he said quietly, "You didn't have to come back in there." "Your horse was down," she said. Roy was watching the south. Cal had Danny. I was the one with free hands." She looked at him. It wasn't a heroic decision. It was just the next logical step. He held her gaze. His face was wet, and there was a cut on his cheekbone she hadn't noticed before, probably from the rock when the horse went down, and he hadn't mentioned it because he was the kind of man who didn't mention cuts while more significant problems were still in progress. "The spring is real," he said. "Yes." "That changes things." "It changes some things," she said. "It doesn't change the Garner outfit, or the piping cost, or the 3 months of work ahead of you." "No," he said, "but it changes whether the work is worth doing." The rain was slowing. The sky to the north was still dark, but the edge of the storm was visible now, a brighter line where the light was coming back. In another 20 minutes, it would probably be passable. She thought about the spring, cold and dark and full, sitting in its rock basin behind them, fed from somewhere deep below the surface where droughts didn't reach. She thought about what it meant for the ranch and the cattle and the families further down the valley who didn't know yet that there was water here. She also thought about the Garner camp, half a mile south, where the sound of the storm had probably covered the noise of 5 people and 3 panicking horses moving through a rock passage. Probably. "We need to go soon," she said. "I know. And we need to go the long way. Not back through the passage, east along the base of the ridge. It adds an hour, but it keeps us away from their camp." He looked at her. "You've already worked it out." "While we've been sitting here, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the boulder shelter, the rain had thinned to a steady drizzle, the kind you could move in. "Is there anything?" he said, and stopped. She waited. "Is there anything you don't think several steps ahead on?" She considered it seriously. "Breakfast," she said. "I'm bad at planning breakfast." Something in his face shifted, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that was clearly, unambiguously, a smile. Not polished, not managed, just the actual expression of a man who'd been surprised into being amused. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then was gone, replaced by the working face again, but those 3 seconds were real. "All right," he said. He stood and looked at the others. "Marsh, Casper, we're moving." Danny looked up from the ground. Some color had come back into his face. "Which way?" "East," Colton said. "Tessa's leading." Nobody objected, not Roy, not Cal. Danny just got to his feet and picked up his horse's lead rope, and they formed up, and Tessa took the front, and they started moving through the drizzle along the base of the ridge with the canyon behind them and the valley opening ahead. Her shoulder was going to hurt badly by tomorrow. Her knees were soaked through, and the cold was working its way up from there. She had mud on her hands and rainwater in her ears, and somewhere back in that rock passage, she'd lost one of her notebook pages. She'd heard it tear when her satchel snagged on the rock wall, and it was probably sitting in a puddle somewhere in the dark. She kept moving. The ridge line above her was sharp against the clearing sky, and the light coming back into the world had that clean, scrubbed quality that good storms leave behind them. And somewhere ahead the valley road was waiting, and further on was the ranch with its flagging pastures and its depleted wells and the 260 cattle that needed water. One step, then the next. That was how you got anywhere. They got back to the ranch in the early afternoon, wet and worn down to the bone. Tessa's shoulder had stiffened badly on the long ride around the ridge, which she'd expected, and she spent the first 10 minutes at the ranch standing by the fence, rolling it slowly in its socket while the others put up the horses. Nobody made a production of the return. No celebration, no extended conversation about what they'd found. They were too tired for that and too practical. The spring existed. The numbers were real. What came next was a different kind of work. Cal Reeder, who had barely said 15 words the entire trip, stopped beside Tessa at the fence and said, "You handled that passage well." Then he walked off toward the barn, which she understood was the full extent of what he was going to say about it, and probably more than he said about most things. Danny Marsh unsaddled his horse and stood there for a moment looking at the ground like he was reassembling something inside himself. Then he looked at Tessa. "I froze in there," he said. "You pressed into the wall like I told you," she said. "You moved when I told you to move. You got out." "I froze first." "For about 4 seconds," she said. "In a narrow rock passage in a storm with a panicking horse. Danny, that's not a character flaw. That's just being a person." He looked at her with the expression of someone deciding whether to believe that or not. She didn't push it. You couldn't hand someone absolution and make them take it. They had to decide on their own. She went inside and changed into dry clothes and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and spent an hour writing up everything from the expedition while it was still sharp. Distances, terrain features, the outflow measurement at the spring, the positions as best she could estimate them, the route notes. Her hand was tired and the writing was not as neat as usual, but the information was there. Colton found her at the table when he came in from seeing to the horses. He'd changed too, and there was a piece of cloth taped over the cut on his cheekbone, applied without much care. The kind of wound management a man does to himself when he's in a hurry and doesn't have anyone checking his work. He sat across from her and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her without asking. "The pipe route," he said. "What's your estimate?" She turned the notebook to face him and showed him the rough sketch she'd done of the terrain between the spring and the east pasture. 3 miles, give or take. The hardest section is here, she pointed, where the rock rises and you'd have to cut or find a way around. That adds cost and time, but this section here is mostly downhill, which helps. He studied the sketch for a while, and she watched him think. He had a way of going still when something needed working out, that same quality she'd noticed that first afternoon at the water trough. "I need to deal with the Garner situation first," he said. "I can't start any construction in there while they're using it as a base." "What are you going to do about them?" "Talk to the county sheriff. He's been wanting an excuse to move on the Garner outfit for 2 years. Nobody's been willing to go in there and confirm what they're doing. If I go to him with a specific camp location and evidence of cattle operation, he can put together a proper party. That takes time." "A few weeks, maybe." He looked at her. "The ranch can hold another few weeks. The spring changes the math. Even knowing it's there and accessible makes a difference because I stopped spending energy on contingencies that aren't going to work." She understood that. Sometimes knowledge was its own resource, separate from action. "There's something else," he said. He said it in a way that meant he'd been deciding whether to say it and had landed on yes. She waited. "Harmon's already lost 12 head. Miller's close to folding entirely. There are 4 other properties in this valley that are going to be in the same position within a month." He was looking at the table. "When this is worked out, the Garner situation, the pipe route, the spring needs to serve the whole valley, not just this ranch." She looked at him. "That's going to cost you access rights and shared maintenance and a water agreement with people who've barely spoken to you." "I know. Some of those people have been calling your judgment into question for 2 weeks because of me." "I know that too." He finally looked at her directly. "I'm telling you because it was your read on the water table that led us there. It seems like you should know what the plan is." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was surprised exactly, but because she was recalibrating. The way you recalibrate when a situation turns out to have a different shape than you'd assigned to it. "All right," she said. She stayed at the ranch 2 more days, which was longer than she'd planned and shorter than it turned out to be needed. The first of those days she spent working out the pipe route in detail. Not just the sketch, but a proper set of notes that a builder could work from, with measurements and terrain notes, and 2 alternative routes around the difficult section with an honest assessment of the cost difference. She'd never done that kind of work before, officially, but she'd grown up watching her father survey land claims, and she'd inherited more from that than she'd ever had occasion to use. Colton read through the notes that evening without comment, then said, "I'm going to need to show this to a contractor." "I know," she said. "That's what it's for." "I'd like you there when I do." She looked up from her own copy of the notes. "Why?" "Because you built the logic of it, and you'll know if he's reading it wrong." That was practical. She accepted it as practical. "All right." The second day he rode into Dry Creek to speak with the sheriff, and she spent the morning in the barn working on the documentation and the afternoon doing something she hadn't expected, helping Danny Marsh with a fence repair that had been sitting half done because one of the other hands had taken sick. It wasn't her job. She'd walked past it and noticed it needed doing, and Danny was nearby, and she'd said, "I can hold the wire if you pull the post," and that had been that. They worked for 2 hours in the afternoon heat and didn't talk much, and when they finished, Danny stood back and looked at the fence line with the satisfaction of someone who'd needed a simple, completable task. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been working up to it for an hour," Tessa said. "Go ahead." He looked slightly caught out, then slightly amused. "Why did you do it? Come out here. Go into the canyon. You didn't have to." She pulled her gloves off and tucked them in her belt. "The water was running out," she said. "I'd been watching it for 6 weeks and nobody was listening. When someone finally asked, I went." "But the risk? Danny, I haul 50-pound flour sacks 3 mornings a week and mend clothes the rest of the time," she said. "I'm not making claims about being fearless. I was scared in that passage, but the risk of going was less than the cost of not going, and I could do the arithmetic on that well enough." He was quiet, processing. "People in town think," he started. "I know what people in town think," she said, "about why I'm out here." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It's not right," he said, and it came out with a sincerity that surprised her a little. Not performed, just honest. "No," she said, "it's not. But it's also not new, and it's also not something you or I can fix by talking about it out here." She picked up the remaining wire. "Let's put the tools away." Colton came back from town with a look on his face that she read immediately as complicated news, which turned out to be correct. The sheriff, a man named Alderman, who'd held the position for 11 years and had, according to Colton, exactly as much political calculation in him as actual law enforcement instinct, had been interested. Very interested. He'd asked good questions and taken notes and said he could put together a party within 2 weeks. But he'd also said something else. Colton told her about it at the kitchen table, Roy and Cal present as well, because it affected the whole operation. He asked who identified the spring location, Colton said. "I told him." Tessa waited. "He said," Colton paused in a way that meant he was choosing words. "He said he'd need to verify the location with someone he could put a name to in the formal report, someone with standing." "Someone male," Tessa said flatly. Colton's jaw tightened. "He didn't say that." "He didn't have to." Roy Casper cleared his throat. "He said he'd want a statement from the expedition party, which includes you, Miss Hale. He just phrased the credibility question in a way that wasn't what?" she said. Roy didn't finish the sentence. Neither did anyone else. She sat with it for a moment. The familiar shape of it, the way something she'd done got filtered through the question of who she was before anyone decided how much weight to give it. She'd been living with that shape for 26 years, and it still had an edge on it. "All right," she said. Cal Reeder looked at her. "All right, what?" "All right, I'll go and make a formal statement to the sheriff, in person. And I'll bring my notebook, which has 6 weeks of water observations with dates and locations, and the expedition notes, and the pipe route documentation." She looked at Colton. "If he needs credibility, I'll bring the evidence and let him work out how to discount it." Something in Colton's expression shifted. "I'll go with you." "You don't need to bet." "I want to," he said. It was quiet and direct and didn't leave much room for argument, and she decided not to argue it. They rode into Dry Creek the following morning, which was not a day she'd planned to go to town, and which meant people saw her ride in with Colton, which meant the talk that had been running since Clara Hayes' store comment got a fresh fuel supply. She could feel the eyes on them as they tied up outside the sheriff's office. She'd gotten better over the years at not reacting to being looked at, but getting better wasn't the same as not feeling it, and she felt it. The sheriff's office smelled like old paper and tobacco, and Sheriff Alderman was a broad man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who'd learned that appearing unhurried made people either relax or reveal themselves. He looked at Tessa when they came in with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly welcoming, more like a man recalibrating an expectation. She didn't give him time to set the terms of the conversation. She put the notebook on his desk, opened to the first page of water observations, and said, "I've been tracking the water table drop across this valley for 6 weeks. This is the record. Dates, locations, measurements where I could get them, observations where I couldn't." She turned to the expedition section. "This is what we found in the canyon, with distances and terrain notes. And this," she turned to the pipe documentation, "is the route from the spring to the Briggs East pasture, with 2 alternatives and cost estimates." Alderman looked at the notebook, then at her. "You put all this together yourself?" "Yes." He turned a few pages. He read carefully, she noticed. Not skimming, actually reading. That was something. "The camp location," he said. "You have this marked here, based on Roy Casper's reconnaissance sketch, which I've reproduced here with his corrections." She pointed to the camp marker. "Approximately half a mile south-southwest of the spring. 2 men observed, consistent with Roy's original count of 7 to 8 total in the area." Alderman leaned back. "You're thorough," he said, "and it came out somewhere between an observation and a concession." "Yes," she said again. He looked at Colton. "You stand behind all of this?" "I was on the expedition," Colton said. "Everything she's documented matches what we saw." Alderman tapped his finger on the desk twice. "I'll take the formal statement from both of you, and from Casper and Reeder when they can come in." He looked at Tessa again with the expression of a man updating a file in his head. "Your observations on the water table, I want to share those with the county land office. They've been trying to get a read on the drought spread for weeks, and none of the ranchers have kept records this complete." She hadn't expected that. She held her expression steady. "That's fine," she said. "I'd want acknowledgement in whatever they produce." Alderman's mustache shifted. "Fair enough, Miss Hale." They gave their statements and left, and the sun outside was bright and the street was busy, and 3 separate people turned to watch them walk back to their horses. Tessa looked straight ahead. Colton untied his horse and stood there for a moment. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it like someone who was prepared," she said, "which is the only kind of handling that works." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she was starting to recognize, that quality of attention that wasn't quite like other attention she'd received in her life. Not the sideways assessment of people deciding what to do with her, not the avoidance of people who didn't want to bother. Direct, and without an agenda behind it. "I need to tell you something," he said. The street noise moved around them. A cart, 2 horses. Someone calling out a name from across the road. "The pipe project," he said. "The spring access agreement with the other ranchers. The water table documentation for the land office. I can't do any of that without someone who understands the geography and can translate it to people who need to act on it." He paused. "I want to hire you, formally. Not for one job, for the whole project, however long it takes." She looked at him. "I'm a seamstress and a supply hauler. You're someone who understands how water moves through land better than anyone in this valley," he said, "and who can put it on paper in a way other people can use. That's not seamstress work." It was not the way she'd imagined this conversation happening. She'd been braced for something harder, more resistance to clear, more fighting for the obvious thing. This was just a man standing on a street saying a true thing. "I'd need a proper wage," she said, "not a courtesy rate." "Of course. And I'd need to be in the room when you talk to contractors and ranchers, not consulted after the fact, present." "That was always the plan," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and what she was looking for she found, or thought she found, the steadiness that had been there from the beginning, the absence of performance. He meant it, not because he'd decided she was remarkable, or because some feeling had overtaken his good sense, because he'd watched her work and reached a conclusion based on evidence, which was the only kind of conclusion she'd ever fully trusted. "All right," she said. They rode back toward the ridge. and behind them Dry Creek went on with its day, and the talk was probably already running through whatever channels talk ran through in a small town, and Tessa put it at her back and kept writing and thought instead about water, where it went, how it moved, the long underground logic of it that had nothing to do with anyone's opinion and everything to do with the shape of the land. The spring was there. The numbers were real. The rest, one way or another, was going to follow. The Garner outfit was cleared out of the canyon on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Tessa and Colton walked out of the sheriff's office. She wasn't there for it. Nobody asked her to be, and she didn't ask to go, because it wasn't her kind of work, and she knew the difference between the things she was useful for and the things she wasn't. She heard about it from Roy, who'd ridden with Alderman's party as a guide. 8 men total, the sheriff and 3 deputies and 4 volunteers who knew the terrain. The Garner camp had fewer people in it than expected. 2 had apparently read the situation ahead of time and moved on. The remaining 5 were taken without significant resistance, which Roy reported with the flat satisfaction of a man who'd been worried about the alternative. The canyon was clear. The spring was accessible. Tessa wrote the date in her notebook and turned to a fresh page. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of work. Not dangerous like the canyon expedition, but grinding in the way that sustained effort always is when the goal keeps receding just ahead of you. There were contractors to meet with, 3 of them, before Colton settled on a man named Hargrove, who was expensive but read Tessa's pipe route documentation without asking her to explain it twice. There were rancher meetings, 4 of them, each one its own particular negotiation. Jim Miller, who was desperate enough to agree to almost anything. The Harmon family, who were proud and slow to accept help. 2 brothers named Deacon, who'd been in the valley longer than anyone and had opinions about water rights that needed careful handling. Tessa was in every one of those meetings. Not as a note-taker, not as a presence that got explained away. As the person who understood the water logic and could answer the technical questions when they came up, which they always did, and could do it in plain language that a rancher with no engineering background could follow. It wasn't easy. There were men in those rooms who addressed their questions to Colton, even when the question was clearly in Tessa's domain, and Colton would turn to her and she would answer, and over time most of them stopped routing around her, if not because they'd fully revised their assumptions, then at least because the efficiency of talking directly to her was too obvious to keep ignoring. Old Harmon, Gerald Harmon, 71 years old, who'd been ranching this valley since before most of the current residents were born, sat across from her at the 3rd meeting and said bluntly, "You're the one who found the spring." "With 4 other people," she said, "but you knew where to look." "I had a reasonable estimate," she said. "It could have been wrong." He looked at her with the evaluating attention of a man who'd spent 7 decades deciding who to trust. "But it wasn't." "No," she said, "it wasn't." He nodded once and went back to the water agreement document, and something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the small, real shift of a conclusion being reached. Well, construction started in late September. Hargrove brought 4 men with him, and they worked from the spring outward, laying pipe in sections through the broken canyon terrain and then down through the easier valley approach to the ranch's east pasture. It was slow work and loud work, and there were 2 setbacks. A section of pipe that was delivered wrong and had to go back, and a stretch of the route where the rock turned out to be harder than the survey had shown and required a full day of drilling. Tessa was on site for most of it, not doing the physical construction, but working alongside Hargrove on the decisions that kept coming up when the terrain didn't match the plan. She slept at the ranch during that period, not in the spare room. They'd shifted her to a better room, one with a table she could spread her papers on. And she ate with the crew at the end of each working day, and something about the rhythm of those weeks felt different from any weeks she could remember before them. Not comfortable exactly. More like the feeling of using muscles you hadn't known you had, the soreness of it mixed up with the satisfaction. Colton worked alongside the crew most days. He wasn't the kind of ranch owner who supervised from a distance. He got in it, laying pipe sections, drilling, doing the physical labor of the thing alongside Hargrove's men, and by the end of each day he came in dirty and tired and sat at the kitchen table and ate food he barely tasted. One evening, about 3 weeks into the construction, she was at the table finishing her site notes, and he came in and sat down and didn't immediately say anything, just poured water and drank it slowly. After a while she said, "Hargrove thinks we'll hit the pasture line by end of next week." He told me. The Deacon Brothers branch is going to be 2 weeks behind that, the rocks section. I know. He set the cup down. Tessa. She looked up. How are you doing? He said. Not as a pleasantry, as an actual question. She considered it. It was the kind of question she didn't get asked often enough to have a quick answer ready. Tired, she said, honestly. My shoulder's still not right from the passage. I've been sleeping well, which is better than I expected. That's not really what I asked. She looked at him. I know. A pause. Outside the window the dark had fully come in, and somewhere in the pasture the cattle were quiet, and the night had that particular stillness that comes after a day of hard work. I keep thinking about what Harmon said, she said, in the meeting, when he asked if I was the one who found the spring. She paused. People are going to know, they already know, probably, and I don't know yet what to do with that. What do you mean, what to do with it? I've spent 6 years in that town being invisible, she said. It's not comfortable being invisible, but it's known. You learn how to move inside it. She looked at the table. Being seen is different. It has different risks. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of risks? The kind where you can disappoint people, she said, where you can fail in front of people, where the expectations become a different kind of weight. She paused. Being overlooked is bad, but being seen and then found wanting is worse. He looked at her for a long time. You went into a canyon in a storm for this, he said. You built the route documentation that Hargrove is working from right now. You sat in 4 rooms full of skeptical men and answered every question they threw at you. He stopped. What exactly would found wanting look like? She didn't have an answer to that. Not an honest one. People don't get to decide your worth based on how well you match their previous assumption of you, he said. It came out with a flatness that meant he'd thought about it, not that he was performing conviction. That's not a standard you should be measuring yourself by. I know that, she said. Knowing it and feeling it aren't always the same thing. No, he said. They're not. He poured more water and she went back to her notes, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the rest of the silence with anything. The pipe reached the east pasture on a Thursday morning in mid-October. Hargrove opened the valve himself because it was his construction and he'd earned the moment, and the water came through in a heavy, cold rush that hit the trough and kept coming and didn't stop. Tessa stood back from the crew while they watched it, because the moment felt like it belonged to the people who'd built it with their hands, and to Colton, whose ranch it was, and whose cattle were already moving toward the sound and smell of water with the instinct of animals that had been thirsty for a long time. She watched Colton's face. He wasn't someone who showed things easily, and he didn't make a production of it, but there was something there, a quality of relief that went deeper than the practical, because relief that's only practical doesn't have that particular look to it. It was the face of a man who'd been holding something up for a long time and finally got to put it down. Roy Casper stood beside Tessa, and they watched the cattle come in, and Roy said, "Well," in the tone of a man completing a sentence he'd started 3 months ago. "Well," she agreed. Danny Marsh was grinning without apparently being able to help it. Cal Reeder was doing the same thing he always did, watching the scene with professional attention, except that there was a looseness in his shoulders she hadn't seen before. Hargrove's men started packing their tools. It was, in the way of real things, both more and less than she'd imagined. More because the water was real, and the cattle were real, and the relief on Colton's face was real. Less because there was no single moment of triumph that felt conclusive. It was just water in a trough on a Thursday morning, and the work of the next phase was already lined up behind it. That was fine. She'd long since stopped expecting life to arrange itself into clean, declared endings. But the town gathering happened in November. It was an annual thing in Dry Creek, not a celebration exactly, more a practical assembly where the ranchers and townspeople took stock of the year and dealt with the accumulated business of the community. This year it had an added weight to it because the drought had touched everyone, and 3 smaller operations had in fact folded over the summer, and the families who'd stayed needed to figure out collectively what the valley was going to look like going forward. Tessa had not planned to attend. She didn't usually attend. These gatherings were social events as much as practical ones, and the social dimensions of them had never been welcoming to her. But Colton had said simply, "You should be there," and hadn't elaborated, and she'd decided to trust that he had a reason. The gathering was in the old meeting hall on the north end of town, a long building with mismatched chairs and a wood stove in the corner that made one half of the room too hot and left the other half cold. About 60 people had come, which was most of the valley's working adults. Tessa came in with Colton and Roy and Cal, and the room did what rooms do: registered the entrance and readjusted, the way a surface disturbed by a stone. She saw Clara Hayes near the far wall. Clara looked at her, and for a moment their eyes met. And Clara's expression was not warm, but it was no longer the particular expression of a woman with quotation marks ready. It was something more complicated than that. A person recalibrating in real time, which is never a comfortable thing to watch, and not very comfortable to be the reason for, either. Sheriff Alderman was there. He gave Tessa a nod when she came in, the kind of nod that means something because it comes from someone who doesn't give them freely. The meeting went through its business: crop assessments, winter preparation, the smaller operations that had folded and what that meant for their neighbors. And then Gerald Harmon stood up. He was not a man who made speeches. Everyone in that room knew that. He stood and waited for the room to settle and then said without preamble, "I want to say something about the Briggs Ranch Spring and the water project." The room was quiet. "I've been in this valley 50 years, he said. "I've seen 3 droughts. This one was going to be the worst." He paused. "It still might have a tail on it, but the water is going to hold for this ranch and the ones connected to it, because somebody sat down and read the land right and went looking in the right place." He looked at Tessa. Tessa Hale read the land right, and then she went and found it. The room did not erupt. Real rooms rarely do. There was a shift in it, the quality of attention changing, people looking at her, some who'd looked through her for years looking at her now in a way that had different contents to it. Mrs. Pruitt was in the 3rd row, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had just noticed that she'd been wrong about something and was deciding how to feel about that. Tessa didn't stand. She didn't say anything. She just absorbed it, the way you absorb something that's both what you wanted and harder than you expected. The exposure of being named in a room full of people, the absence of the invisibility she'd worn so long she'd forgotten it was a choice she hadn't made. Colton, beside her, didn't look at her. He looked at the room, but she felt him shift his weight slightly, the small adjustment of someone who is choosing to stand squarely beside a thing. When Harmon sat down, there were a few other voices. Roy said something brief and accurate, Hargrove said something about the construction, and the meeting moved on to other business, because that's what meetings do. The world doesn't stop to mark its recognitions. It just incorporates them and keeps moving. Afterward, outside in the November air that had gone cold and clean, with the first real chill of approaching winter, people talked in the way they do after public gatherings. A few people came and spoke to Tessa directly. Not many, but some. Jim Miller, whose operation had survived partly because of the water agreement, shook her hand without apparent awkwardness. An older woman she barely knew told her she'd done good work, which landed simply and without complication. Clara Hayes passed within 10 feet of her and paused and said, "Miss Hale," in a tone that wasn't warm but was civil, genuinely civil, which was not nothing. "Mrs. Hayes," Tessa said, and let it be. Colton found her at the edge of the gathering, near the road, where the light from the hall windows reached and the noise was muffled enough to hear the wind in the dry grass. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "How was that?" he said eventually. "Strange," she said. "Good. Strange." "Both at once." "Both at once," she agreed. He looked out at the road and the dark beyond it, the ridge just visible against the stars. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to take it as what it is and not what you're used to things being." She waited. "I don't know how this goes," he said. "I'm not easy to be around, I'm told. I work too much and I talk too little, and I've made a mess of most things that required more from me than practical decisions." He stopped. "But I know what I'm looking at when I see it, and I've been looking at you since that morning at the water trough, and I haven't stopped." He paused again. That's not a speech. I don't have a speech. It's just the true thing. Tessa stood with that for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass and a horse stamped somewhere in the dark, and the sound from the hall was warm and distant behind them. She thought about the boarding house table and the notebook and the 6 years of being furniture in other people's rooms. She thought about the flour sacks and Clara Hayes's quotation marks, and the specific loneliness of a person who is useful and overlooked, which is its own kind of loneliness. Not the simple kind, but the compound kind, where you start to wonder if being seen and being used up are actually different things. She thought about a man in a narrow rock passage in a storm, trying to get a fallen horse up by himself in the dark, who moved when she told him to move. "You're not easy to be around," she said. "You're also not careless, and you listen, which is rarer than it should be." She looked at him. "I don't need a speech either." "What do you need?" he said. Direct, the way he always was, the way she'd come to rely on without realizing she was relying on it. "Time," she said. "I need it to be real before I believe it's real. I've been surprised in the wrong direction enough times that I don't move fast on things like this." "That's reasonable," he said. "And I keep the work," she said. "The water project, the land documentation, whatever comes next. That's mine. It doesn't belong to the relationship, it belongs to me." "It was always yours," he said, and he meant it, and she knew he meant it. They stood there while the gathering wound down behind them, people filing out into the cold, the lamplight in the hall windows going eventually dark. The valley spread out below them in the night. All that land they both knew differently now, not as a place that had failed them or overlooked them or assigned them a diminished role, but as a place with a particular geography, with water running through it in ways you could read if you paid attention, with a future that wasn't guaranteed but was at least possible. There's something most people don't understand about being invisible for a long time. They think it leaves you hungry for recognition, for the moment when the room finally looks at you and revises its assessment. And maybe some people do want that. But what Tessa found, standing in the cold outside the meeting hall in November, was that the recognition mattered less than she'd thought it would. What mattered was the work. The 6 weeks of watching, the notebook, the spring, the pipe route, the meetings, the actual substance of what she'd done. Being named by Harmon was something, but it wasn't the thing. The thing was that the water was running. She'd spent 26 years being a woman a town could look through like glass. She hadn't disappeared just because they weren't looking. She'd been there the whole time, paying attention to the things that needed paying attention to, building up a knowledge that turned out, when the moment came, to be exactly what was needed. That was worth something. Not because other people had finally noticed it, but because it had always been true, noticed or not. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked at the ridge and thought about the spring somewhere beyond it in the dark, still running, cold and steady, and fed from somewhere deep where seasons didn't reach. "Come on," she said. "It's cold." They walked back through the dark toward where the horses were tied, and the stars were clear above the valley, and the dry grass whispered in the wind, and Dry Creek settled into its winter night around them. Imperfect, complicated, real. The way all living things are when they're actually alive. They stood there while the gathering wound down behind them, people filing out into the cold, the lamplight in the hall windows going eventually dark. The valley spread out below them in the night, all that land they both knew differently now. Not as a place that had failed them or overlooked them or assigned them a diminished role, but as a place with a particular geography, with water running through it in ways you could read if you paid attention, with a future that wasn't guaranteed but was at least possible. There's something most people don't understand about being invisible for a long time. They think it leaves you hungry for recognition, for the moment when the room finally looks at you and revises its assessment. And maybe some people do want that. But what Tessa found, standing in the cold outside the meeting hall in November, was that the recognition mattered less than she'd thought it would. What mattered was the work. The 6 weeks of watching, the notebook, the spring, the pipe route, the meetings, the actual substance of what she'd done. Being named by Harmon was something, but it wasn't the thing. The thing was that the water was running. She'd spent 26 years being a woman a town could look through like glass. She hadn't disappeared just because they weren't looking. She'd been there the whole time, paying attention to the things that needed paying attention to, building up a knowledge that turned out, when the moment came, to be exactly what was needed. That was worth something. Not because other people had finally noticed it, but because it had always been true, noticed or not. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked at the ridge and thought about the spring somewhere beyond it in the dark, still running, cold and steady, and fed from somewhere deep where seasons didn't reach. "Come on," she said. "It's cold." They walked back through the dark toward where the horses were tied, and the stars were clear above the valley, and the dry grass whispered in the wind, and Dry Creek settled into its winter night around them, imperfect, complicated, real. The way all living things are, when they're actually alive.